My name is Uchenna Obaji. I am the daughter of Magdalene Johnson Obaji and the granddaughter of Tobias Johnson and Albertha Porte Johnson.
Did your mom tell you stories about growing up in Liberia?
Yes, my mother came to the States when she was a teenager, 13 or 14 years old. So I think a lot of her memories are tied to her youth in Liberia and just memories of being around friends and family and growing up on the rocks, as she would always say. So a lot of her time in Liberia, I think, is associated with her childhood.
And tell us about your experience with your grandmother.
Yeah, so when I was about 2 years old, my grandmother was in the States and she suffered a stroke. So a lot of my memories of my grandmother aren't of her being as lively and full of life as I've heard of so many stories of her being. So a lot of my stories are post her stroke, unfortunately, but I still very much could always feel her energy and the liveliness of Albertha Porte Johnson. So for the first part of my childhood, my grandmother was living in Rhode Island with my uncle. And when I was probably in middle school, we decided to move my grandmother to Virginia, which was much closer to where my family was. So a lot of my memories were visiting my grandmother in her nursing home, which was not far from where my parents and I lived. And so a lot of the memories are just there. And when family would come to town to visit, it was always such a big ordeal and celebration, taking everyone to the nursing home and spending time with her. So yeah, a lot of my memories of my grandmother are of that, just family and celebration, even just spending day-to-day time with her.
So a significant tradition of taking care of elderly parents. What did that experience teach you about your mother?
Yeah, I mean, culturally, I think just being of Nigerian and Liberian descent, I think caring for the family and caring for the elders in the family is just instilled in you from birth. But I think it's definitely something that I've seen firsthand in my family. Just the fact that my grandmother was living with my uncle in Rhode Island is caring for the elders. When we moved my grandmother to Virginia, is again caring for the elders and always making sure they're close, always keeping the family unit tight no matter what. So that's just ingrained. It's been ingrained in me from the beginning, and it's definitely something that I saw my mother and my uncles and my aunts do from the start.
Now, turning the page a little bit, tell us about your mother and your relationship and the impact that she's had on your life.
Yeah, my mother is an incredible woman. I would say she's one of my best friends. I'd say that she's one of my first friends. I think I'm fortunate enough to have a really great, strong relationship with my mother. And so I've been lucky to have that. I now live abroad in Belgium, so I'm not as close to my mom physically as I used to be. And even that's been quite an adjustment period, you know? So despite the fact that I'm 33 years old, I'm still calling my mom and checking on her, and she's checking on me. And I think as I've gotten older, this relationship of like caring for each other, I think has developed a bit more. I think when you're a kid, you rely so heavily on your parents for love and affection and attention and validation. And then as I've gotten older, I think I still seek those things, but I also feel the need to reciprocate and give that to my mom as well. And again, I think it just goes back to continuing to keep the family close and keep the family tight and caring for our elders. I think as being an adult now, I feel the need to care for my mom, even though she's still very much able-bodied and still very vital and moving around and has more life than I do. I still feel the need to care for her and check in on her as well as my father.
Can you take us back a little bit in terms of your education, your career, and how you came to be living in Europe?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, I was born in New York, and at about the age of 4 or 5, my family moved to Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., and that's where I spent my childhood and the first part of my adulthood. So I grew up in Northern Virginia, went to university at George Washington in Washington, D.C., and then after graduating, moved back home to Northern Virginia, lived with my parents for a few years before, again, moving to New York as an adult and living there for about 6 years. And prior to moving to New York, I found who would be my life partner, my husband, Thomas, who I met in DC. I moved to New York. We eventually started our lives together in New York. And in the last several months, we've moved to Belgium and starting our lives here, really starting our next chapter and figuring out what that's going to look like for us and for our future. So yeah, it's very exciting to try and, keep all of these family traits strong, and even the thought of possibly starting a family and really starting that next generation and keeping traditions and our ancestry strong is something that we've definitely talked about from the beginning and that we're looking forward to doing.
There's so many different ambitions that you touched on there. What do you do to keep yourself centered?
I think family is the most important part. Family, spirituality, I think is really important. Always knowing that God is with me, God is with my family, but also just my family in general. I think that's very much the tangible aspect that I can rely on all the time. Is, like I said, keeping family close, constantly checking in on my parents, them checking in on me, my siblings, my older brother, my younger sister, really just keeping our family unit strong. And since being married, my family has grown even more now, right? So I have in-laws, I have a father and mother-in-law, I have a sister-in-law, I have a brother-in-law that I've inherited through being married. So really this idea of just growing this community and growing our family unit has been really something that's important to me as well as to my husband, and that we hope to continue to do.
And looking to the future, how can your generation and future generations show their gratitude to the ancestors?
I think the most important part is, I think the theme is just keeping that family unit and the community strong, right? I think the only way for us to hold on to where we're from is speaking to the elders, those who've been there, those who grew up there, those who've since come to the States, listening to those stories, taking in those stories, incorporating those stories with our own, and really just continuing to pass them on. It's something that I've experienced with my mother and my uncles and my aunts and cousins and all of my extended family, just hearing all the beautiful and wonderful and all of the stories about our family and our history is just amazing. And I think that's something that my generation now coming up as the quote adults in the family, really continuing to do that for the next generation, all the nieces and nephews and grandkids that are coming. I think it's incredibly important for us to continue to tell those stories and continue to have the next generation interacting with those elders as they age and move on, just really keeping that history strong and telling those stories.
What's one story of your grandmother that you're going to be sure and tell your children, God willing?
I think a lot of the really great stories of my grandmother come from stories that have been told to me. Like I said, unfortunately, I didn't have as much of an interactive relationship with my grandmother due to her illness, but just so many of the stories I heard about my grandmother. She was a midwife in Monrovia that delivered thousands upon thousands of babies. I don't know if anyone even knows exactly how many, but just hearing all the stories of the woman that she was and the strength that she had, and her graciousness and her caring, the fact that people would come to her clinic having to deliver babies and didn't have money to pay her, yet she would deliver their babies, she would feed them, she'd give them their medication, make sure everything was taken care of. And I think that's one of the things that stands out about my grandmother to me, and just kind of seeing that sense of community that she had. You know, whether you had or you didn't have, she was going to take care of you. And I think that's something that I've seen my mother and even my father have in their lives, and giving to others and sharing with others, whether it's family and friends and community. And it's something that I hope to do as well, and that I hope I'm doing. And so really just keeping that attitude of graciousness and being kind to others, I think is so important.
Anything else you want to say?
No.
There's a lot of traditional or modern family gatherings for different milestones throughout people's lives. What is a milestone that you in a tradition that you feel like you can carry on with, of course, with help and with advice, but what's something that's really stands out for you?
I think the importance of seeing where we come from. As an adult, I have not been able to go back to Monrovia and go back to where my mother and where my family is from, unfortunately, due to the circumstances. But I think it's important that at some point I want to go back. I want to see my family's land. I want to see where my family is from. And God willing, I have children as well. I want them to do the same. So the idea of knowing where you come from, going back to where you come from, and just taking the energy from that to hold within yourself and your life, I think is really important. So that's definitely something that I want to do, and I want to have as tradition in my family, is going back to where you're from and really taking the energy from that place.
Excellent. And then just thank your cousin.
Thank you, Cousin Shireen. I'll talk to you soon.